You're listening to Barbell Logic,
the podcast where we talk about what it means to experience strength
and how you can use simple, hard, and effective strategies in training and nutrition to improve your life.
It starts with meeting you where you are right now and finding lasting solutions.
Welcome to the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to Barbell Logic, Beast Over Burden. I'm your host, Niki Sims. With me is Andrew Jackson. We are both coaches for strength and nutrition at Barbell Logic. We also help run the coaching team and the app development, Turnkey Coach. So today we're going to talk about pancakes. Just kidding. We're also going to talk about barbell stuff, but mostly I'm counting down the hours until I can have my next feeding of Kodiak cakes.
Pancakes.
Pancakes. At any time of the day. Recently discovered how much of a wonderful pre-workout that is. They have like 3 grams of fat or something minimal, 36 carbs, I think, and then 15 grams of protein. And that's just if you only use the mix in water. And then if you use some of the Fairlife milk, it like totally ups the protein. You can add an egg. Anyway, I'm pretty stoked. I don't know if you...
Syrup. Add a little extra sugar pre-workout.
A few more carbs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty stoked. Just like I eat like the same things pretty much all the time during the day. Like during the day is my time when I eat exactly the same things the whole time. And this is a new integration and it's high protein. So you know how it is. Very exciting to have a new food.
Always fun when you get a snack that you enjoy, a little different and fits your macro goals.
Yes. Yeah. High protein, not just, jalapeno kettle chips. Also delicious. Not high protein.
Yeah. I've been trying to get protein anytime I eat. So it's nice when you can find something that's feels like you're eating carbs, but you're still getting a decent amount of protein in there.
Yeah. Also, my cast iron pan is so wonderfully seasoned that, as you know, it is better than my nonstick pan. And it has so much tasty bacon flavor.
Yeah, I actually learned I think probably the most effective way to season a cast iron pan from you. And that is to cook bacon in it every single day.
Yes. And then walk away.
just let it sit there. And occasionally pour out the excess grease.
Because you need to use it for something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's worked really well.
So besides pancakes.
Anyway, talking about balance.
Well, I thought we could actually talk about barbell related stuff. We've had some great discussions about barbell emotions.
Yeah, life.
And I think it could be a great, chance for us to get back to maybe some barbell logic this week.
Indeed. Well, what's on your mind?
Well, I just was curious. We've been coaching for several years now, decades, some of us. And I noticed that cues kind of come and go, different areas of focus become more in vogue, if you will. So I'm curious what cues, both as a coach and a lifter, you find yourself going to frequently in this year of 2023.
Yeah, I have definitely started honing in on the importance of a rigid torso and what that means for the musculature in the anterior of the spine. So many abs there that you can use to create a contraction and increase intra-abdominal pressure that contribute to a rigid torso more than just creating back extension. And I think that was part of the idea from the beginning of creating a rigid torso, but so much of our cues and our coaching eye and my movement pattern was really wrapped around trying to extend my lower back. That me personally, I've kind of gotten to a bad place of being in too much extension and not projecting that on everybody. But I am really more aware now of cueing people on how to use more than just their erectors and a breath to really involve more of that abdominal musculature. And we've talked about that. I actually really like how you describe it now using all that meat, which explain how you imagine it. I really like it.
Yeah, my go-to that I've been personally using, and also I like to tell my clients that instead of just thinking about arching your back to try to set your back, I imagine having all that muscle on the anterior side of my spine. There's two ways I like to think about it. Either think of making like a bed of muscle that your spine gets to lay into and be supported by, typically underneath the spine, because we're mostly bending over. So as you're bending over into the squat, you're locking your abs in and creating this support structure for your spine to be on top of, along with setting your back. But if you think about the muscles on your back, which are significant, there's still a lot more padding and meat on the front side that can be made solid to support your back.
Yeah.
And another way I like to think about it is like both my back, my spinal erectors, my lats, and my abdominal, the anterior muscle, wrapping the muscle, like I'm trying to grab my spine from both sides three-dimensionally and just really locking the spine into place. Now, there's going to be some movement. I'm not saying that you're going to be perfectly still, but I feel much more supported and stable and consistent through particularly the squat. But I find that works well with the press and actually the deadlift. I'm finding myself focusing even more on contracting the anterior side of my torso.
And I've seen this make your lifts look quite different. I observed some time ago when I would watch you squat and when I would watch you deadlift, there was always a moment on the ascent of the squat and as you're picking up your deadlift where your hip opening would kind of freeze and then you would extend your back. And that's what would be the next movement. And so that's a lot of work on the erectors for sure. But it was contributing to the bar movement, but hip extension was kind of frozen for a moment.
Right.
And recently, I haven't seen that in either your deadlift or your squat. And I'm wondering how that feels different for you.
Yeah, it feels different. And I see it also in my clients that when knee flexion or extension and hip flexion and extension is not synchronous, it's typically because something is happening in your spine to compensate for the fact that your hips and knees aren't moving together. And unless you're out of balance, which is another symptom of this happening, but a lot of times people will compensate for, particularly I notice it on the descent of the squat, the knees start pushing forward. People think that they need to cue pushing their butt back. And so they get an arch, an overextension in their low back.
Yes.
Which is sort of absorbing what should be the hips closing and the butt actually pushing back, but their chest ends up staying up. And that feels balanced to them.
Yeah, it's like the top half of their body looks like a high bar squat, and then the bottom half of their body looks like a low bar squat.
Right.
Because they're trying to keep the bar over the midfoot or something, and it ends up in an arch.
Well, it feels balanced in their foot when they do that. Because their knees pushing forward and their chest is lifting up. You can't maintain that in the bottom. You don't have enough strength. So what happens is the knees kind of come forward gradually in the bottom. And actually what's typically happening is they're not pushing their knees forward soon enough. Their lower back is kind of masking that as well. And then in an extreme case, what happens is they drift forward into the bottom. Their knees kind of slide forward and then the extension comes out of their back. And then they repeat that on the way back up. Typically what happens going into the bottom, you're going to see bouncing back out of the bottom. And so you get this really wavy, inconsistent, unpredictable squat pattern because their back is just kind of being a noodle. And you get really inefficient force production and often imbalance.
And your effort is misplaced. Like your effort at the bottom, like that's the toughest part of the squat in terms of like how moment forces are distributed, where the main joints are the furthest away from the weight of the bar. You end up kind of fighting for it with back extension.
Right.
Instead of like knees out, sinking into the bottom of your squat, getting deep and being able to drive up with your legs.
Right.
And I remember feeling like, I don't know, maybe like for 6 years, I squatted with my lower back. And there was a clicking point, and some workouts more than others where I was like, oh my God, I can actually feel like I'm squatting with my legs now. That feels really different.
Right.
And I think it's because, just like what you're talking about, you have enough contraction on the anterior of your spine that you can have enough structural integrity to sit into depth and then drive up.
Right.
Without having to like dig out of it with extension. Does that sound like what you're talking about?
Yeah, that. And if you think about it anatomically, the origin and the insertion of most of the muscles in your leg that are responsible for helping you stand back up. If you are sliding forward and then bouncing backwards, like I was describing, and your hip joint is shifting around from overextension, getting back into neutral, and then overextending again as you stand back up, you now have the origin and the insertion of your adductors, your quads, your hamstrings, all kind of sliding around, and often a lot of variation. If you're not consistently setting your knees, keeping your back set, and sitting into the bottom with a consistent stretch, where your ischial tuberosity and the tibial plateau are consistently anchored for you to be able to stretch into the bottom. That's been my experience, is that when I wasn't setting my back effectively and I wasn't getting my knees set, sitting down into a big stretch, it was hard to really develop any kind of power or feel like I had any power. Obviously, I was still standing back up and had strength, but as I got closer to max effort, I was not able to recruit, I don't think, legs, knee extensors or my adductors as effectively as I have been more recently.
And what do you think is happening to the bounce down there with all that?
It's just really inconsistent. And that's a big change that I notice is historically, or, when I'm not being consistent with my back, setting my back and setting my knees, going into the bottom is sort of like, well, I wonder what's going to happen this rep.
Yeah, totally. It feels like a trust fall.
Yeah, sometimes you hit it and you're like, oh, wow, that was a great one. Then you go down the next rep and it's like survival mode. Whereas I think when I'm more consistent about setting my back, which enables me to then also be more consistent setting my knees and getting into a tighter bottom position, the reps feel like I'm able to work, is maybe how I would describe it, is that I'm able to consistently hit the bounce, use my legs, and it feels more like I'm doing a leg press, to be honest. Like it just feels like I've got that stable, balanced position in the bottom, and that I'm able to work using my legs and my hips. Obviously, those are opening too. But like you said, one of the biggest differences with both my deadlift and my squat is my legs and hips are working together now as I stand up, instead of having this shift back, throwing everything into my hips, and then I open my hips kind of like in the second half, where my legs really aren't being productive or as productive as they could be moving the bar. It's more like I'm skipping out on moving the bar, shooting my hips back, and then trying to lever my hips open to finish the lift.
Your knees straighten, your hips move up, but the bar doesn't move very much. Doesn't move as much as your hips.
Right. And then I just go through this like Herculean hip extension to get out.
Totally. This is why you're so good at good mornings. I'm noticing, I don't think I cue my lifters as much anymore with the cue of reach your hips back.
Yeah.
I think more of what I'm doing now is telling them get their knees set and to hold their knees in position. Because obviously the hips are going to go in a certain direction based on where your knees are going, because they're connected by the femur. But there's far less reach, hips back.
Right.
Because I think that turns into too much hip flexion at the bottom of the squat. And then I think the knees cave in addition to that, when there's too much reaching back.
One of my favorite things to do when I'm doing my video reviews is if a client's, and it's typically because they're thinking about pushing their butt back, they do the little like low back arch, little booty pop. I love getting to that like 2 or 3 frames, and then I make them do a little booty dance. It's
like a GIF.
Because you can see them just like popping their butt back over and over again.
Yeah.
I'm like, see that? Don't do that.
Don't do that. Yeah.
Brace
I have a
your
couple
abs,
lifters who come
push
to
your
mind
knees
who,
forward.
Yeah, it's too much extension to hold on to by the time you get to the bottom. And like this came up for me in my anecdotal experience lately, where, when I had my back stuff going on, a couple of different people like, well, you have a little bit of lordosis, so your discs are really closely spaced in your lower back. And I didn't get super freaked out about it, because I was like, well, someone's going to show me a picture of my back and they're going to give me something that they believe that I should be afraid of. And I was like, okay, well, that's just what my lower back looks like. But I think what happened is aging, or you get a little bit more sensitive to that, there actually becomes some maybe arthritis, or, your discs do continue to change shape or thickness. And so really harping on back extension all the time was where so much of my movement pattern was going. And I just became more and more sensitive to it, partnered with having a shoulder injury that I really never got looked at or anything. But with the shoulder injury came so much loss in range of motion through that joint that I was compensating all the time with going into extension in my back. So I just became so sensitive to lower back extension that I feel the best now when I'm doing more flexion and when it's really partnered with more abdominal contraction. So I'm wondering how you cue and teach your lifters to use abdominal contraction to lay their spine upon.
A lot of it is just getting them to pay attention to their abdominals, crunching down, bracing. I've borrowed a cue. I think I heard from you first, something like keep your sternum and your belly button parallel, or like touch your sternum to your belt, kind of a cue.
I imagine like nipple line and waistband line. Whatever distance they are at the top of the squat needs to be about the same by the time you get to the bottom of the squat. And if that distance lengthens, then you've gone into extension. If it shortens, you've gone into flexion.
I've been lately experimenting with this feeling that I have. This is going to be hard to describe, but it almost feels like there's probably a technical term for this muscle group, but that I've got sort of like this attachment from my abs down into my groin along my abdominals. It might be the transverse abdominals that are kind of reaching down into my pelvic area. And I can almost feel that locking in. And when I sit down into the squat, this is particularly where I feel it, although I do notice it on the deadlift as well. Instead of feeling like I'm pushing my butt back, which tends to make me overextend, I almost feel like I'm like sitting down into that muscle along with my adductors. And it almost feels like it's part of that basket of muscle that I'm trying to sit down into, my glutes, my adductors. So I almost end up feeling like my torso is sitting more down than back.
Oh, that's cool.
And so I have not really cued that to many clients because I don't have a great way of describing that. Mostly what I'm cueing them to think more about is crunching down more on their abs, bracing their belt, maybe 360 degrees. That's another one that I like to feel for, is less emphasis on trying to get my back to arch and more about trying to feel like I have muscle contracting around my entire torso.
I dig that.
How about you? Do you have any go-tos?
One thing that I'm working on lately is cueing the transverse abdominals. And I've also learned that this is the muscle group that women, after they've given birth and maybe have suffered diastasis, I can't remember the medical term, but when their abs split, like they have to really strengthen their abs again as they get back into squatting. And they do a lot of transverse abdominal exercises. And these are some exercises that Coach Rebecca Krieg had me doing when I was working with her, which was really useful. And another one I just picked up from going to PT that I like to visualize is, and you can try this too, is laying on your back on the ground, knees up with your feet flat on the floor with something like a yoga block or a bench block or a foam roller or a pillow between your knees. And when you inhale, you really inflate your belly all the way down to between your hip bones, like big, big, big inhalation. And then when you exhale, you try and bring that whole inhalation, that big bulge you just created, you try and pull that down towards the floor, resulting in a posterior tilt. And then what I imagine are my hip pointers squeezing in towards each other. So now instead of a crunch, it's actually like a sideways crunch, really. You could think of it that way, where your transverse abdominals, which do run perpendicular to your like six-pack muscles, they're contracting towards each other. They originate like along the bottom of your rib cage and along the top of your pelvis, and they run like horizontally. So when you try and squeeze that, it's a much different contraction than like your obliques or the most superficial ab muscles contracting vertically. So I like that when I'm like inhaling and exhaling, I imagine those muscles contracting towards each other and feeling that brace now, like my hip bones are coming towards each other. And that feels much different because now I have a lot more control over my pelvis in the front, and this visualization of like my rib cage being an upside down bucket, my pelvis being a bucket.
That's another image I use. Yeah.
Yeah, they have to be like right on top of each other and not like splitting in one direction or the other. Like they need to be facing each other the entire time that you're bending over and standing back up. So I really like the hip bones moving towards each other for transverse abdominal.
I don't know if it's physically possible, but what I notice I feel, which sounds kind of similar to what you're feeling, is that it might be one of those things where it's not actually occurring, but it might effectively be happening, or it might feel like it is, that my torso feels like it's getting shorter. Like
Yes,
I feel like I'm almost like
yes,
compacting my torso instead of when I
yeah,
notice when I arch a lot, it feels like my torso is longer.
right. And you'll see some people do that when they take a breath, they get taller, and that's not what you want.
Yeah, when I tighten everything down and kind of compact my torso, I feel like my squat's just tighter. Like everything is closer together, more locked in, more efficient, power transfers better, and I tend to lift more weight, most importantly.
Most importantly.
Well, actually, even more importantly than the weight on the bar, I feel more consistent and balanced in terms of the muscle that I'm using. I mean, I've lifted more weight before out of just sheer force of will and, solving the problem of standing back up, but it does not feel good.
Right.
Like,
and you don't feel like you can do more. You're like, well, that was the limit.
that was the limit for the day. I don't feel like I was working. I was just surviving, just squat morning the thing back up. And I feel much more fatigued afterwards. That's another thing that I do notice, is that when I'm not lifting efficiently, or when I'm not in that compact position, the squat will really wipe me out for a long time. Whereas when I'm using, I think it just comes down to the fact that I'm using more muscle mass more efficiently, then I'm not feeling super beat up or fatigued in one area or the other.
Which usually ends up being your back.
It usually ends up being the low back. Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, it feels like it's a much more effective training stimulus for my legs as well, which is really what a squat is.
That's a concept right there for you.
Supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So
if you could give people 2 cues to walk away with today, what would they be?
Well, an external cue for me would be that wrapping your spine in muscle, or supporting your spine in muscle. And then, the other big one for me that I just keep coming back to over and over again is balance in your full foot, which we haven't really talked about up until now, but that is the one that I think is supposed to be what the master cue, which people probably remember or know of the master cue as imagining the barbell tracking down over the middle of your foot, which I think is a fantastic external cue and does a lot of really good things, right up until the point that everybody has a phone and can now watch themselves squat. And I've noticed over the last 10 years, as that's become the norm, people have now taken a cue, which is a thing that you hear and try to interpret into solving a movement problem, into an actual
task,
what they expect to see, which, Burgos wrote a great article that includes a lot of these discussion points, but depending on the weight on the bar, the barbell will not simply track perfectly over the middle of your foot. If you're squatting several hundred pounds more than your body weight, that might indeed be pretty close to what it looks like, but it should not ever be the priority over feeling balance in your foot. The master cue of imagining the barbell over the middle of your foot is really trying to get you to imagine balance in the middle of your foot, tracking perfectly up and down. Now, it's probably beyond the scope of this podcast to talk about all the biomechanics and the physics as to why, but short version is what you're really doing when you're in balance is maintaining the combined center of mass of the barbell in your body over your center of balance, which is approximately the middle of your foot. And what that should feel like at all times for compound movements is even pressure across your full foot through the entire range of motion, whether it's the squat, the deadlift, the barbell press for that matter, or any other compound movement. really any barbell movement unless you're trying to bias it in a certain way to maximize the moment arm so that you're training a muscle group.
Like an RDL or something.
Something like an RDL, you might push your hips back and shift the weight a little bit onto your heels so that you're getting more stress put on the hip extensors, which is the purpose of that exercise. It's an exercise designed predominantly for hamstring hypertrophy. But a squat, a deadlift, a barbell press, they're all going to be more efficient and better if you're maintaining balance in the system. That's probably the second cue that I just keep coming back to. And it's the one that I tend to tell people, I'll give people something that I want them to work on, whether it's their setup or to like set their intention. But balance is the thing, and even pressure in their foot is the thing that I want them using throughout the lift as a feedback mechanism.
And they can feel it instantly. It doesn't have to be after the rep. It's right there.
Exactly. It's one of the things that I keep going back to, particularly as an online coach, because they need something to have a feedback mechanism when I'm not there. So like I can give them the cue after the session that they can take into the next one and work on. But rep to rep, that's probably the best thing that they can do, to at least have like a check and balance to make sure. I'll often use that as the check and balance when I give them a cue. I'll say, here's what I want you to think about and do on, fill in the blank lift, but don't do it at the expense of balance, which is what I think a lot of cues where, that's when it drives people off the cliff is if you tell people, imagine the barbell's over the middle of their foot, and they take that all the way to the extreme of the fact that they're almost falling over, trying to actually keep the barbell over the middle of the foot, which I've done myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say use that cue of maintaining the distance across the front of your body. Thinking of like one specific point you can use is where your ribs meet, the xiphoid process. Keep that distance between that and your belly button and the waistband of your pants. See if you can maintain that distance the whole way down, the whole way up. And when you inhale, don't get taller. Make yourself compact.
Mm-hmm.
Compact squat is the goal.
Right.
So if you feel like you've, like you just talked about, compressed yourself, and you can think of the squat almost as being an ab exercise and maintain the midfoot, I think you're going to feel yourself in your legs in a really powerful way.
Have you had anyone overdo that cue to the point that they're in flexion, like where they're like hunched over?
I actually don't think so.
I'm wondering if this is one of those things, like I said, where cues kind of come and go in, seasons, where I wonder if we're just having to kind of unwind people overdoing the
I think so.
chest up cue over the last decade. And now we're going into an era where we need to focus a little bit more on the anterior.
But it's also kind of an instinct when the bar is on your back.
That's
to
true.
Not let yourself fold in half. Like as the belt is the tactile cue for your abs,
Right.
the bar is the tactile cue for your back.
True.
To some extent. But I do think that we are having to unwind some emphasis.
Yeah. There's still quite a few people when they're first learning to deadlift that seem to struggle with the concept of extending their back.
Yeah.
But honestly, I've actually been becoming a little bit, my thinking has shifted a little bit on the emphasis of the upper back needing to be as extended as much as it has. And I would much rather see consistency from like the chest down. Because one thing I noticed, particularly when it gets sufficiently heavy, you can't maintain the same thoracic extension in a true max effort deadlift. But I still want them kind of locking in and getting that more compact torso.
Yeah.
And I want them to maintain a back angle more than anything. Same thing as with the squat. Like, you'll see people set their upper back and they can get into this really big thoracic extension, chest up, and they can maintain that up to, 275, maybe 315. And then above that, what happens as soon as they start loading their upper back, it rounds. And sometimes they're able to stop that at a certain point and finish the lift. And other times it seems to like carry over into losing all of their back extension because they get into the habit of just feeling their back getting pulled out of that position, and they kind of end up hanging almost like a fishing rod on their back.
On a squat?
On a deadlift.
On a deadlift. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm finding myself focus more on, yes, we need to set your back, but again, make sure you're also creating that bed of muscle on the front.
Yeah.
And locking in that compact high pressure torso so that you're maintaining your back angle through the entire range of motion.
My 2 cues for that are trying to bring like your ribs to your triceps and your triceps to your ribs with the intention of contracting the lats and then making their arms really long. So it's ideally kind of pulling them out of their really upper back and getting them more into the musculature that kind of keep the arm angle closed, which if you can keep the arm angle closed, so it's likely that you're maintaining a good back angle. But yeah, that fishing hook image is real.
Both of these, or a lot of this conversation to me, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is about being able to maintain consistency from rep to rep and efficiency during the contraction. And I'm less concerned of it as a safety issue. I don't really think of it as like, oh no, you're going to hurt yourself, other than the fact that I think tissue that's not exposed to a consistent stimulus is going to be at more risk of getting pissed off. You know, if you're not training tissue over a consistent period of time to be exposed to a load or a, certain volume or tonnage, that's when I think connective tissue or muscle gets irritated. It hasn't had a chance to adapt to it. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, I haven't been lifting this way, building up to my 500-pound deadlift, and then I just put it under 500 pounds of load. Things can get uncomfortable. Or if you're consistently overusing, for me, it was my low back doing a squat morning, then that's where I tend to see things becoming a problem compared to, it doesn't mean being perfectly consistent isn't also going to have an injury at some point in time, but the training seems to be a lot more productive towards the goals if you can reliably count on a rep, feeling consistent rep to rep.
Well, I would suggest everyone read Michael Burgos's article. Grab a cup of coffee and be alert for this one. It's meaty.
It's a long one.
It's called Seeing the Subtle Simply Squat Mechanics and You. And if you want someone to take a look at your squat, at your deadlift, at any of your lifts, we will happily do that for free. We have something called the Barbell Logic Experience Call, where we'll set you up on our app for a little test drive. Meet myself, the other Niki, or Chrissy Marples. We will watch your lifts and give you some advice. And to do that, go to barbelllogic.com/experience, and you'll have a chance to pick a time on one of our calendars and show us your lifts. We'll let you know what to work on. We'll give you some cues. And that's it for the day.
Let's go get some pancakes.
Oh my gosh, it's time for pancakes. Hallelujah. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you got some value out of this. If you did, please leave us a review. Give it a share with someone who is deadlifting like a fish hook. And we'll see you here next time. Thanks, Andrew.
Bye-bye.